Hello, world. It's John Pinto, your roving realtor and bon vivant, here with Ted Stephanos. Did I get the right syllable?
That's
Of
correct. Yeah,
HomeGuard Natural Hazard Disclosures, and Rafael Betances with HomeGuard Roof Termite Home Inspections and Home Warranties. And gee whiz, I wish I could do some videos with guys named John Smith and Joe Brown. It's
What's the
complicated.
fun in that?
It's hard even getting off the dime pronouncing your names.
well, I could
So,
have I could have left it Stephanopoulos if you wanted.
oh yeah. Well, while we're at it, what's the whole name? The whole gory Greek name there, Ted?
Well, so Ted translates to Theodoros, which is gift of God, right?
Yeah.
Of course, of course.
Yes,
Your wife tells me that you tell her that all the time.
right. And then middle name is James, which is Demetrios, and then Stephanopoulos, which is crown. So Stephania is a crown. At the Greek wedding where
Hmm.
the bride wears the crown and the groom wears
Yes.
the crown, and it's a beautiful ceremony. But that's the Stephania, or Stephanos crown, gift of God crowns. It's
I, I am in royalty. I am in the company of royalty.
that's right.
You can just call me Rafa B, John. I'm not that
Ralph,
royal.
Ralphie, hey, Ralphie, like in the honeymooners. Say Ralphie.
Yeah.
So let's say here we are in the middle of actually, we're not even in fire season, and we've had more than our share of fires. But before you know it, we could be in flood season. So we're talking to Ted about his role with natural hazard disclosures, and let's anticipate what we might be looking at in terms of flood disclosures and flood season coming up. So, in the disclosures, Ted, can you explain to us the different categories of flood?
Sure. So on the natural hazard disclosure statement, there are two disclosures that are related to flooding. One of them is area of potential inundation due to dam failure, but that's not what we're talking about now. But it does confuse the buyer in many cases because one can be checked yes and one can be checked no. And they'll call us and say, hey, our lender's not requiring flood insurance. They say it's not in a flood hazard zone. And our report also confirms it's not in a flood hazard zone, but it might be in an area of potential flooding due to dam failure. And so they get a little confused on that area of potential flooding, right? Well, that's due to dam failure. So that is one of the categories. So buyers have to understand when they're reading the NHD report that those are two separate disclosures. The one that's what we're talking about is the special flood hazard area. So these are zones that are determined by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. That was established back in 1968, the National Flood Insurance Program, and it was a way really uh, for FEMA to establish guidelines for flood hazard zones. They've used the Army Corps of Engineers to determine where areas could potentially flood due to, usually it's like an extreme rain event where you have overflowing rivers and creeks. And what they call that is the 100-year flood zone. So the 100-year flood zone by definition is an area that could flood once every 100 years. Now, it doesn't mean it ever has flooded in the past, because that's one of the common questions we get is like, this can't be in a flood zone. I've lived here for 30 years. It's never flooded before. Well, based on statistical averages, it should flood once every 100 years. So literally it's a line drawn on a map, and it's based on many cases statistics and history. And so these lines are drawn on the maps, and whether it's an NHD company, a city planning department, county planning department, lender, or appraiser, we're all using the same source of information, the same
Right.
source.
So let's talk about the practical implications of looking for houses in or out of the flood zone. I remember I lived on South 16th Street in San Jose for many, many years, and I called my wife once. I said, look out the window, Ellen. We have a new lake, Lake Coyote, because we lived across the road from Coyote Creek. And
Yeah, was that near Willow Street Park there?
that was half of William Street Park was underwater.
Oh, sure. Yeah, but you know how it slopes down quite
Yes.
significantly, right? So that's the old riverbed.
Yeah. And we
So
were okay. We were okay. But some people down closer to 24th Street, McLaughlin Road,
sure.
Alma, they got hammered down there. So this may be going out of your expertise a little bit, but your opinion still matters. What is the latest with the flood maps as they pertain to flood insurance and getting flood insurance? Do you have any insight into that?
Well, are you specifically referring to the flood that happened like 4 or 5 years ago?
I've been in real estate for 47 years. I've seen floods coming and going all the
Yeah.
time. And I know at our California Association of Realtors meetings, one of the top topics of discussion is always renewing the flood insurance programs on
Right.
the federal level, because
Yeah.
if we don't have flood insurance, we can't sell houses in floodplains because we can't get flood insurance and we can't get loans.
Right. Yeah, those areas, many of those areas that flooded in that event in San Jose a few years ago were already mapped in a floodplain. But the most important legislation that came about of that is to inform or disclose to tenants if they're in a flood zone, because what we usually talk about is sellers and buyers of real property. We're not talking about rental situations. So what happened in that situation, because a lot of those homes and townhomes and apartments were rented, that information that they were living in a flood zone was never disclosed to those tenants. And so what happened was that they passed a law. It was I forgot what it was, the Senate bill now. It's been a few years. I have it on my notes here. But it's basically a new disclosure requirements that if you're a landlord, you would need to disclose to the tenant if they're in a flood hazard zone and or a dam inundation zone. So they would know that they can get renters insurance and flood insurance to protect them from any future floods. That was never required in the past, like it is in the NHD report for sales.
All right. So I guess suffice it to say that I think the takeaway on this video is forget about the dam inundation. We'll talk about that in a separate video. Let's talk about whether or not it's in a floodplain. I think the important thing is if you're looking in an area, say like Willow Glen, which has a lot of low-lying areas, a lot of creek beds, a lot of underground aquifers, and lots of houses in the flood zone. I think you need to be mindful as a buyer as to how willing you're going to be to make an offer on a house in a flood zone, and you better get your quote on your fire insurance and your flood insurance before you even start looking, let alone make an offer or buy a house. Would you say that's an appropriate takeaway on the flood disclosure?
Yeah, it would be. And if you're also speaking of Willow Glen, I would be the first person there to put sandbags around La Via Deli to make sure that never floods.
We need our raviolis.
Got ravs, right?
Got to have ravs. See, and this is, again, a reminder that Ted is Greek and I'm Neapolitan. It's amazing that this is the first time we've mentioned food in any of our videos, Ted. We have to remedy that situation.
Like you say Willow Glen, that's the first thing that pops into my head. So
yes, we will make a plug for La Villa Delicatessen. They are quite good. They've got one of the better deli counties in Santa Clara County. I don't know anybody that's got a better deli counter than them. So very good. So do you want to volunteer any other takeaways on
well, the good
fires?
news is that FEMA is making improvements to the Guadalupe River channel. So many of those areas that are in Willow Glen are going to be actually removed from a flood zone in the upcoming years. So what they do is make improvements to the flood control channel by either widening it or clearing out the brush. And they've done that on the north edge of Santa Clara down through downtown San Jose, and now they're working southward along Guadalupe River to make improvements. So, FEMA does, and the Army Corps of Engineers, they do make a lot of improvements to remove areas out of a flood zone. Now, conversely, in some cases, they put areas into a flood zone that previously weren't. And sometimes that will happen, and there's really not much you can do about it as a homeowner. You can fight it at City Hall when the FEMA representative comes to town, but I've never really seen them change maps, and because of based on someone's opinion. But
Right.
And Ted, where can we find this up-to-date information on what they're working on currently, like what you just mentioned with the bags?
Well, FEMA does have what's called, so FEMA has a website, of course. It's the Map Service Center. They do have a section on there called preliminary flood hazard maps, and so you can review preliminary maps, and that preliminary means like a couple years in the making. So it could go back, it could be quite preliminary for a couple years. Santa Clara Valley Water District also maintains a really good information on their website about projects, so flood control projects. So
Okay.
Excellent. So I know I've got a house on a lagoon off the Napa River that I bought in 2002. And the Army Corps of Engineers did a tremendous amount of dredging, demolishing old bridges with the wrong kind of caissons, cleaning brush, and it just pretty much eliminated flooding from the equation. So you're spot on in terms of not only understanding the disclosures and the history, but also what type of infrastructure is under construction right now. So that's good advice, Ted.
yeah.
So yeah, go ahead, Ted.
And and homes that are built in flood hazard zones now are required to be built above the base flood elevation. So newer homes, can still be developed in flood hazard zones. It's just that the developer has to build it in such a way where they're building these areas above the base flood elevation. So if you're familiar with the Great Mall in Milpitas, that whole area is in a flood hazard zone, but those townhomes that were built about 10 or 15 years ago are built probably about 6 feet above street level, because the flood hazard zone is still there, but the owners of those townhomes don't have to pay flood insurance because they're built above it, literally above the base. So it could still flood. They might need a canoe to get to Trader Joe's or whatever, but they'll dry. The home would be dry. Now that's all based on statistics, like where they anticipate the flood to be and how high the water to get. Now, if it's a 200-year flood or something even more severe, then those areas could still be flooded. So, then it's up to the individual homeowner. Even though the lender's not requiring you to pay flood insurance, do you still want to buy flood insurance at a lower rate to protect yourself from any future flooding? Because I'm not sure what the exact averages or percentages. I think it's about between 30 to 35% of the flooding that occurs around the United States occurs in areas that aren't even mapped in a flood hazard zone. So yeah, just because you're in a zone, what they call a zone X, which is like a shaded area, 500-year flood zone, that doesn't mean you don't have to worry about it, because you can be really close to the 100-year flood zone and the lender's not going to require you to pay flood insurance, but the risk is still there to some degree. So you could still get flood insurance, and it might only cost a couple $100s a year. And then, you're kind of guarding yourself in that too. So it's not only important to know whether or not you're in a 100-year flood zone or not, but where you are in relation to them as well.
Well stated. Well, thank you, Ted from HomeGuard NHD, and thank you, Rafael from HomeGuard Roof Termite Home Inspection. And again, the takeaway on this is when you're looking for a house and when you're listing a house, do be very proactive on understanding what the flood disclosure is going to indicate, what the cost and the risk are that go along with that. And with that, we will conclude this video and see you on the next video.